Hello and welcome everyone to Stat Chasing Week 10. We are halfway through the regular season. My name is Sam Hoppen and I am your host for the show. I've got a new camera set up. Christina said it was kind of weird that I was looking above the camera, so trying something new with the camera on top, but that means we might get a little Crosby appearance if he's running around in the background here. But anyway, thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't watched the show before, this is where I go through some of the key stats that I think are important to helping lay my foundation for research for the week, for helping understand what happened this past weekend. There's a lot to decipher after a crazy Week 9 of NFL football. But before I get into the details, I want to talk through the stats that I'll be using on the show today. From PFF is where I get all of my routes data. So that's targets per route run, any other routes data that I mention or routes metric that I mention on the show. I also use their expected fantasy points, which is a model that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage and where a player gets targeted. And this is for PPR points. And I use this primarily as a measure of player usage. It helps show which players are getting the most high value opportunities for fantasy football. From NFL Faster, which is the NFL play-by-play data, I get air yards, which is the distance that a ball travels in the air before it gets to a receiver. I also have weighted opportunity rating, which is a metric that Josh Hermsmeyer created and weights air yards market share and target market share. Also have RACER, receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards, and it shows a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. Also have PACER, which is sort of the flip side of RACER. That's passing air conversion ratio. This shows how well quarterbacks or the receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. And that's just passing yards divided by passing air yards. Also have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt for quarterback, but just weights it with interceptions and touchdowns, gives some bonuses for touchdowns and takes away for interceptions. Another quarterback stat is CPOE, completion percentage over expectation. Shows there's a model with NFL Faster that shows, again, whether a pass would be expected to be completed, and then determines that rate for a player and whether or not they completed more passes than expected. And then have pass rate over expectation, which again is a model that determines the percent chance that a play would be a drop back for a team and compare that to the number of times or the percentage of times that a team actually drops back. Some stats that I'm also using that have been popularized by Ben Gretsch. I have weighted targets per route run, which weights air yards and route runs with a scalar included. I primarily use these for wide receivers to show some distinction in how wide receivers are being used. And also have high value touches, which is a running back specific metric. This is carries inside the 10-yard line and any reception. I'll also refer to green zone touches, which is any touch inside the opponent's 10-yard line, whether it's a carry or a reception. So I'm going to be going through these stats position by position so I can compare, again, against other players within the position, hopefully help you make your start, sit, waiver, trade decisions, maybe put a little DFS spin on it as well. And then I'll go more in depth through some team situations at the end of the show. And a reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member for just $5 to get early access to this show, be able to watch it live, get access to the Discord that me, Pete, Pat, and several others are in, and a bunch of other benefits. Be sure to check out Pete's merch store as well. You can get one of these slick ship chasing hoodies. And one final shout out to @ChallengeCollege on Twitter, who has been doing an awesome job adding the timestamps to the YouTube for each of the positions and the team conversations. So with that, let me bring up the first chart and we'll get into the quarterback position first. So here I am showing quarterback efficiency and production for the last 5 weeks. So that's weeks 5 through 9. On the x-axis, I have that adjusted yards per attempt that I mentioned. I have touchdown rate on the y-axis, and then the size of a player's bubble is his rushing yards. So with the quarterback position, looking for efficiency, because volume is not necessarily what drives fantasy scoring for the quarterback position. You want to make sure, again, that you have a quarterback that is efficient with the opportunities that he's given. But the first quarterback that I'm going to talk about is Daniel Jones. He started the year strong and was averaging over 22.5 fantasy points per game in, I believe, his first 4 games, and he's averaged just over 11 points per game in his last 4. I remember mentioning him on a show a couple of weeks ago, saying that he was starting to look like a top 10 quarterback, but that is no longer the case. You can see him way down in the bottom right part of this chart next to, some poor quarterbacks like Jacoby Brissett, Taylor Heineke, Patrick Mahomes, other players like that. But in the last 4 games for Daniel Jones, he just has a measly 2.9% touchdown rate, a 5.9 yard average depth of target. So he's just not pushing it down the field. He's got a 5.0 adjusted yards per attempt, and he's throwing for fewer than 200 passing yards per game. And what's really made sort of the biggest difference in his fantasy production is that in those games, he only has 3.7 carries per game and is only averaging about 17 rushing yards per game. So that's been sort of one of his big calling cards, not only this season, but in seasons past. And if he can't maintain that, then he should not be on the radar for fantasy football starting quarterback consideration. But he surprisingly only has a negative 1.8% CPOE, which, again, I would have guessed would be much lower just based on the lack of production that he's put up. But the Giants are just not throwing it that much. I believe they had like 18 attempts this past week. So I don't know if it's that they don't trust, Daniel Jones, but the volume certainly has not been there. They do, in the next 3 games, they play the Bucs, the Eagles, and the Dolphins. So those are 3 teams that you would think he'd be able to exploit the matchup of. Obviously, a lot of teams facing the Bucs have a very high pass rate over expectation, but I would be a little weary about starting Jones in any of those games unless you're desperate or in a 2 quarterback league. The other player that I'm going to talk about is Matt Ryan, who's had a bit of an up and down season so far from a fantasy perspective, at least, and hasn't really been that consistent. He's had some peak weeks, scoring over 25 points per game, 25 fantasy points in a single game, but has also had several floor games where he scored fewer than 15 fantasy points. Over his last 5 games, he's showing up in this top right part of the chart here, which is good and leads me to believe that I think I'd rather start Matt Ryan over Daniel Jones at this point. I was actually messaging with a friend before the show, talking from a DFS perspective about the potential for stacking the Dallas offense because they play the Falcons this week. And I think the better side for that would actually be Matt Ryan, because he's going to be probably much less owned, and their offense is getting a little bit more concentrated with Calvin Ridley out. But anyway, Matt Ryan over his last 5 games is averaging 290 passing yards per game. He's averaging over 2 passing touchdowns per game, and has about 20.5 fantasy PPR points per game. And part of what's boosted that is the 6% touchdown rate that he's been throwing at, and that's been really, really good for him. Has an 8.4 adjusted yards per attempt and a 69% completion percentage as well. So I tend to lean, again, even though he hasn't been quite as consistent from a fantasy production standpoint, that the Falcons are sort of starting to figure it out, and Arthur Smith is sort of showing why he was hired in the first place. So I switched to the chart. I'm going to switch back real quick. I wasn't going to talk about him, but Sam Darnold is just not he's in a bad place right now, and there have been some talks early this week that his spot as a starter is not guaranteed for this upcoming week. As you can see on the chart, over his last 5 games, has a touchdown rate below 2% and adjusted yards per attempt under 3 yards. So it is not good. It's, DJ Moore's had a couple of down weeks as a result of that, and Robbie Anderson's had a down season as a result of that, but he is not necessarily the quarterback that we thought he was in the first several weeks of the season. One other quarterback note, this was from Ben Gretsch and his Stealing Signals newsletter. Highly suggest you all subscribe to that. Him and I have a lot of the same processes. We share the same spreadsheet that we use for looking at stats. But he pointed out that Josh Allen had a 6.1 passing average depth of target, and this was his second straight week at or below this number, and he was previously at or above 8 yards average depth of target in his first 6 games. You can see Josh Allen on this chart with just a very poor performance against the Jaguars. And if there's any debate as to whether the Bills loss or the Dallas loss was worse, it is most certainly the Bills loss, because that was they just took an absolute dirt nap against the Jaguars. But in any case, this past week was Allen's worst fantasy performance of the year by far. I believe he had single-digit fantasy points, but I'm not concerned about Allen himself. I'm not planning on talking about Stephon Diggs, but I'm a little bit more concerned about him at this point, just with Allen's lack of targeting players downfield the last couple of weeks. Got to open the water bottle. Okay, moving on to the running back position. On this chart here, have rushing expected fantasy points, or EP, on the x-axis, have receiving expected points on the y-axis, and then fantasy points over expectation, or FPO, as the size of a player's bubble. The first backfield I'm going to talk about is a request from Mr. Eric Belair. Wanted me to talk about the Colts running backs. I'm not going to talk about Marlon Mack because he's played just 5 snaps in the last 3 weeks, was a healthy scratch this past week against the Jets. But Jonathan Taylor, top 2, not 2. He is just absolutely crushing it as of late, has a snap rate above 60% in each of the last 4 games. His previous season high before those 4 games was 55%. He's been at least 69%. Nice. The last 3 weeks as well. Nyheim Hines did get up to 45% snap share, which was his highest since week 3 when he was at 56%. And I really don't know what to make of that. I'm not that worried. He was involved a little bit early on, got the early score against the Jets on the ship chasing crew bench, which was really nice. But I'm not reading too much into that because, again, Jonathan Taylor is just dominating so far. Over his last 5 games, he's averaging nearly 27 PPR points per game. He's got over 100 and nearly 110 rushing yards per game. Has a 67% share of the running back touches and is averaging over 19 opportunities per game as well. And the biggest thing is that in those 5 games, Nyheim Hines doesn't have a single green zone touch, and Jonathan Taylor is averaging 2.6 per game. So that's the biggest thing, is he's getting the opportunities when the Colts get down near the goal line and they want to pound it in. Jonathan Taylor also has a 56% routes per drop back rate over those 5 games as well. His receiving expected points has still been at about 4.4 per game in the last 5 games, which is not great. That's sort of about where it's been all season, and he's averaging nearly 10 fantasy points over expectation. Now, I don't see that really changing because, again, I think that they can continue to pound the ball with him. I believe they play the Jaguars this upcoming week, so he's in a prime spot for that as well. But where there is, I think, maybe a slight concern is that Nyheim Hines over the last 3 weeks has a receiving expected points per game of about 6.9. So Hines is still getting probably the most valuable of the receiving work, or the most valuable receiving work in that offense. But again, because Jonathan Taylor has just been producing so well, he's averaging about 1.4 rushing touchdowns per game over the last 5 games, and he has about as many targets as Hines over that time. So I'm not really worried. Again, he's got 20 plus opportunities in each of his last 3 games. And even though Taylor's routes per dropback rate dropped to 48% after being above 55% the last 3 weeks, again, the Colts were not forced to throw the ball that much against the Jets either. And Jonathan Taylor showed with a couple of his long breakaway games that he can certainly get there on efficiency, and he's got the opportunity to match up with it. So I'm still keeping Hines on my bench. I think it is slightly encouraging for Hines that Marlon Mack was a healthy and active and is basically an afterthought, and probably will continue to be a healthy scratch. But I'm not feeling confident enough to plug him into a starting lineup, even though he just scored a touchdown. Okay. So Jonathan Taylor, RB1 season rolls on. He's crushing it and will continue to do so. The next backfield is the Patriots backfield. The Patriots running backs, Rhamondre StevenSZN, the cover boy this week. He looked really good on Sunday, had a 41-yard gain, but he and Damian Harris both suffered head injuries. Unfortunately, I believe they're both in the concussion protocol right now, but still wanted to talk about them because things are changing a little bit. StevenSZN does have at least a dozen PPR points in 2 of his last 3 games. So that's not Jonathan Taylor level, but I don't think we would expect him to be there. But after being a healthy scratch in week 7, having a 16% snap rate in week 8. Rhamondre StevenSZN was at 27% in week 9. That was still his third highest of the season. He was at 34 and 33% in weeks 5 and 6. And Damien Harris was at a 39% snap rate. But again, I chalk that up to the injury because that was his lowest since the 33% share that he had in week 5. But the guy who got the majority of the work, and this was primarily down the stretch, was Brandon Bolden. He had 47% of the snaps. But the issue with this backfield, as it always has been, even though, again, we thought things would be different, is that in week 9, Damien Harris had 16 total opportunities, Rhamondre StevenSZN had 12, and Brandon Bolden had 10. So it's just it's unconcentrated. There's not one guy who's getting the majority of the work. Now, the Patriots' pass rate over expectation has dropped significantly. I mean, like their pass rate over expectation by week is just going down, 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 as Jason Derulo would say. So in that regard, if they are going to keep running the ball, they might have some value. And the work from, the Patriots running backs are not getting that much passing work either. Since James White got hurt, only one time has a Patriots running back run a route on more than 40% of dropbacks. And I believe that was Brandon Bolden back in like week 5 or 6. So the clear distinctions in this offense come in the red zone. Over the last 5 weeks, Damien Harris is still averaging 3.2 green zone touches per game, which highly outgains the 0.6 and 0.5 green zone touches per game from Bolden and StevenSZN respectively. But that's the biggest thing for him. I mean, he's got an average of 18 opportunities per game in those 5 weeks. So he's still doing well. Nobody in the backfield is averaging more than 5 receiving expected points per game, and that's Brandon Bolden. But still, he's averaging fewer than 3 targets per game, and that's just not good enough to be a starter. So I do think and hope that StevenSZN sort of works his way into the Rex Burkhead type role where he's getting pretty much an even split of carries and targets in the game. So it's certainly, again, it's not the best case scenario for StevenSZN, but things are certainly improving. He's getting more passing work than Damien Harris is. So if Brandon Bolden were to sort of get phased out and StevenSZN were to get all those opportunities, then StevenSZN would make a very appealing option, I think more so even than Nyheim Hines. One last thing on the Patriots running backs, and this is from JJ Zachariason. Damien Harris saw his lowest running back rush share of the season at 45% this past week. And he still hasn't hit a double-digit percentage target share this season, but he's scored a ton of touchdowns. I mean, he's averaging over 1 touchdown per game in the last 5 weeks. And because of his touchdown equity and the high value touches that he's getting, he certainly remains a weekly starter if he is healthy. The final fullback field that I'm going to talk through, and then I'll get to a couple other notes, is with the Saints running backs, and really going to look at the last 2 games with Mark Ingram in the fold. Where Kamara has taken the biggest hit is to his snaps. And every game this season, aside from week 1, he was at a snap share above 82%, and he hasn't been above 70% in the last 2 weeks. He's been at 67 and 68%. Mark Ingram's been at 29 and 34% the last 2 weeks, but he's still getting just about as many opportunities in total. He's still averaging the same number of targets. He's averaging 3 fewer carries per game. But again, and this is the key, is Kamara's averaging 3.5 green zone touches per game in the last two games. So that's 7 total. Mark Ingram does not have a single one yet. So there's an opportunity there again with Kamara where he's getting those opportunities inside the 10-yard line. Again, Kamara's averaging 1.5 fewer PPR points per game, so I'm not worried about that. His routes per dropback has dipped 5% to 56%, so that's not a concern either. And his overall touch share has gone down from 84% to 64%. But again, I think this is a scenario where Ingram, hopefully it stays this way, Ingram is getting some of the low value touches and is giving Kamara an opportunity to rest sort of when they're in the middle of the field or sort of between the 20s, and lowers the risk of injury for Kamara. His rushing expected points, Kamara's that is, his rushing expected points per game has actually risen by over 1.5 points per game, and he's averaging a negative 3.1 fantasy points over expectation per game. So there's even more meat on the bone left for Kamara to get while Mark Ingram is in town. The other hope is that Trevor Siemian remains the starter and Taysom Hill is not used a ton, because that I think would potentially crater Kamara's opportunities just in total, because Taysom's really either going to just throw the ball deep or run it himself, and is the bane of my fantasy existence, especially when it comes to Alvin Kamara. So final thoughts on there. I'm still holding Alvin Kamara. I'm still holding Mark Ingram because he is a valuable handcuff. He's actually averaging as many receptions per game. They both have 7 receptions over the last 2 weeks, so has some PPR equity as well. And don't think I'm really selling high or buying low really on any of them. There hasn't really been an opportunity to do so. Moving on to a couple quick hitters. This from Ben Gretsch, just talking about the Ravens backfield, and Tyson Williams was just an afterthought. He didn't get any touches. I prayed that after the bye week that they would get him involved, but he can be safely dropped. Devontae Freeman had the majority of the opportunities. He had 16 total opportunities. Le'Veon Bell had 11 opportunities though, and Freeman seems like the lead back right now. He ran a route on 54% of dropbacks. The running backs for the Ravens don't typically get a huge target share, obviously because of Lamar Jackson's ability to run, but Devontae Freeman did get the 2 green zone touches in the game to just 1 for Bell. Obviously, I think the big news, and I'm sure the guys will talk about this tomorrow night, but Chase Edmonds suffered a high ankle sprain early in the game this past week, is on injured reserve, and will likely be out at least 3 games. But with him getting hurt early in the game, James Conner had a season high 67% route per dropback rate, and his previous high on the season was 38%, and had a season high 5 targets, and he had just 5 total targets across the season before this game. He obviously had that long screen that he housed for a touchdown, and I think I'd expect Benjamin to get about 50 to 60% of Edmonds' workload and the rest going to Connor. But assuming the Cardinals don't add anyone, I think Connor is a top 5 running back while Chase Edmonds is out, if he's getting, again, that 4 or 5 targets per game. The Jets this past week had a total of 3 high-value touches. Mike White was injured early on, and he was sort of known for, dumping it off to both Michael Carter and Ty Johnson. But they were the Jets running backs were averaging 16.5 total high-value touches per game over the prior 2 weeks. So just, I think, sort of a bad spot and unlucky situation. I'm not that worried. On the flip side, Dalvin Cook led the league in high-value touches this week. He only had 8, which I think is a pretty low total. But despite getting a whopping 5 green zone touches, he failed to score a touchdown. He could be in for, I think, a blow-up spot against the Chargers this week, who obviously have one of the worst rushing defenses. And then Myles Gaskin, my guy Myles Gaskin, he put up over 15 PPR points, but he had 20 carries for 34 yards. He did play a season-high snap share and had 7 high-value touches. So, again, this sort of shows the value of high-value touches and that if players can get that, then, again, that's the sort of volume that we need and that we're looking for from our running backs. Okay, that's it for the running back position. Moving on to the wide receivers. On this chart, I have weighted targets per out run on the x-axis, air yards market share on the y-axis, and then the size of the bubble as their fantasy points over expectation. The Titans wide receivers, I'll start here first, and I think I'll talk about the Titans running backs next week after we have another game under our belt without Derrick Henry. But I really just want to talk about A.J. Brown. He had a down game from a fantasy perspective, but had a massive 87% air yard share in week 9, which is just absurd. This game, after a stretch of several great games for Brown, he had 16 PPR points, at least in 3 straight games. But looking at the last 5 games since Brown returned from injury, and Julio Jones played for 3 of these games, so sort of keep that in mind. But his metrics are just off the chart. 0.86 Whopper, 52% air yard share, 35% target share, running a route on 91% of dropbacks, only has, surprisingly, about 13 receiving expected points per game, which is much lower than I would have expected. Obviously, he's averaging 3 fantasy points over expectation per game. And him and Julio are the only 2 receivers on the team to be running a route on over 70% of dropbacks in that offense. I believe I saw earlier that Josh Reynolds asked for his release from the Titans, so that'll, I guess, remove one name from this offense. But A.J. Brown has at least 9 targets in each of his last 4 games. He has at least a 30% targets per route run rate in each of his last 4 games. And over the last 5 weeks, a Titans wide receiver hasn't recorded more than 5 targets in a single game that isn't named A.J. Brown. So I think this is an opportunity where I'd be buying high on A.J. Brown. I mean, I guess you could consider it a buy low if, again, someone sees his performance this past week and is dissuaded from it, but they are for sure going to lean on him down the stretch. He is their best player right now. I'm checking my phone here because Odell Beckham was obviously released last week. I was just seeing it. There was a note before the show that he cleared waivers and he wants to go to the Packers. So just seeing if there's any news on that front. But anyway, going to talk about his former rival, the Ravens, and their wide receivers. We still haven't had a chance to see what life would be like with both Sammy Watkins and Rashad Bateman playing together. I think our first opportunity to see that will be on Thursday night. Sounds like Watkins is trending towards playing. But looking over sort of Bateman's stats over the last 3 weeks while he's been playing, he has an 18% target share, a 20% air yard share. He's running a route on 71% of dropbacks. He's averaging nearly 12 expected points per game, averaging just under 10 PPR points per game. This past week, he did have a season high 76% routes rate, which is really good. He was actually top 10 in air yards on the week, too, with 111. And I hope this is a situation where, again, the Ravens see that Bateman is the better prospect and the better player, and Bateman continues to get that post-bye rookie bump. But his teammate Marquise Hollywood Brown, continuing to have a very good season as runner route on over 90% of dropbacks in 3 of his last 4 games. Now, again, those have all been pretty much without Sammy Watkins as well, so will be interesting to see if his route rate drops. But he has at least 10 targets in 3 of his last 4 games as well, and has a targets per out run rate over 24% in his last 2 games. So Brown is, again, having a really, really solid season. I think continues to get disrespected by the fantasy community, or some people in the fantasy community. Bateman does have an 11-yard average depth of target over the last 3 weeks, which is the lowest of between him and Marquise Brown. I forget what Watkins is at, but I'm really hoping that Bateman leads this team, not leads this team, but gets an opportunity. There's obviously Mark Andrews in this offense. Sorry, spacing on names here. Mark Andrews on this offense that I'm not gonna talk about here, but really, really good start, at least for Bateman in his career with his first 3 games. Speaking through these wide receivers here a little bit, the Broncos wide receivers want to look at what things have been like with Jerry Jeudy back, and it's in the notes on the YouTube, but hit the panic alarm for Courtland Sutton, because it hasn't really been great the last couple of games. He only has 6 total targets. He has 144 total air yards over the last 3 weeks after a stretch of averaging over 150 air yards in 3 straight games, and is averaging fewer than 4 PPR points per game. And Tim Patrick actually leads the team in air yards over the last 3 weeks with 195 himself, but Courtland Sutton's targets per route run rate has dropped to a season low 7.1% this past week. It's just not really looking that good for him. He's still running a route. He's run a route on 90% of dropbacks over the last 2 weeks, which is great. And, that's leading the team. He's tied with Tim Patrick with a 90% route rate, and Jerry Jeudy's at a 77% route rate, who I'll talk about here in a second. But this is all just way, way down from what he had in the first 6 games without Jeudy. He was averaging over 9 targets per game, had, again, averaging over 150 air yards per game, had 17 PPR points per game. So it's not it's not looking great. His target share is at just 12% in that time span, while Jerry Jeudy has a 24% target share since he has returned, averaging 6 targets per game, has a weighted targets per out run of 0.56, which is solid, a 0.49 whopper, just ahead of Tim Patrick, who's at 0.48. And Tim Patrick actually in the last 2 games, like I said, has a 36% air yard share. His average depth of target the last 2 games has shot up to 16.8 after being at about 11.7 the week before. I think Patrick could be a potential sell high if someone is buying him. He's averaging 6.5 fantasy points over expectation per game over his last 2. Had a nice touchdown this past week as well. So I think that right now Jeudy is probably the best bet for the rest of the season, assuming he's not going to be not a concern with respect to the injury, and then Courtland Sutton behind him. So I hope things change for Sutton because, again, he was putting together a really nice year, but this past week was just so bad, and that was even without Noah Fant. So hopefully better days ahead, but Jerry Jeudy looking like he's picking up sort of right where he left off. On the flip side of this game, Phil B asked what happened with Dak, Lamb, and Cooper. Cooper and Lamb both had fewer than 6 PPR points per game. That was both of their lowest in several weeks, and it's one of those situations where I'm just throwing it out the window. I'm not really concerned about it. This is what I was talking about, when I mentioned my friend thinking maybe the Cowboys go a little under-owned this week because of how poor they did, but they do play the Falcons. Lamb did lead the league this past week with 212 air yards on Sunday, but just did absolutely nothing with it. Over the last 5 weeks, again, looking at their stats, Lamb and Cooper are pretty much neck and neck in almost every major category. They both have a 30% air yard share. Cooper's at a 19% target share compared to 21% for Lamb. They're both running a route on over 80% of dropbacks. Both have about 13 receiving expected points per game. So I think, again, in the long run, I am not concerned about the Cowboys. It looks like their pass rate over expectation 2 is sort of leveling back up to about even at a 0%, which is not where we want it to be, but it's better than the negative 4% rate it had been at the several weeks beforehand. A couple other final nuggets here. The Jaguars continue to frustrate the hell out of me. Dan Arnold led the way with 7 targets, and Marvin Jones, Jamal Agnew both had 5 targets. Laviska only had 4 targets, but all 3 of those receivers didn't even hit 30 receiving yards. The Jaguars only threw for 151 yards in their game over the Bills. I'm frustrated because in the concentration of target share chart that I share, Laviska is not appearing on any of them. So it's looking like he is just not a part of the offense, and Jamal Agnew has taken over in DJ Chark's stead. Hopefully I still get to do this show next week after saying that. But moving on, Baker Mayfield actually completed passes to 8 different players on Sunday, and no player had more. Speaking of unconcentrated passing attacks, no player had more than 5 targets in the game. Landry did lead the team with 5 targets. Donovan Peoples-Jones had a long touchdown, but this offense remains overall centered around the running game and has one of the least concentrated passing attacks even without Odell Beckham Jr. This final note here is from Kevin Cole of PFF. He broke down that in weeks 1 through 7, his Ja'Marr Chase, weeks 1 through 7, his expected fantasy points over expectation was 55.5, which was first. And over the last 2 weeks, he's had negative 24.5 fantasy points over expectation, which is last. And so basically, and he's got 48.5 expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks, which is first among receivers. So basically, this is all to say, if you want an opportunity to buy low on Ja'Marr Chase, now is the time. He's still getting a ton of valuable looks. And again, this past week, he just did not perform well. He still had 13 targets. So an opportunity, if there ever was one, to go out and get the stud rookie receiver. Okay, the tight end position, have the same chart here as the wide receivers, and going to talk through 2 guys today. The first being Evan Ingram. He has 3 straight games with double-digit PPR points. Unfortunately, I mentioned Daniel Jones earlier in the show and how he hasn't performed, but fortunately, we don't really need a quarterback to perform well for position players to do well in fantasy. But Engram ran a season high 96% of routes in the game this past Sunday. He's averaging only 5 targets per game over his last 3 games, but has that's good enough for an 18% target share, which is actually pretty good for a tight end. Kyle Rudolph still remains somewhat involved. He's got 3.3 targets per game over the last 3 games. Ideally, those would go to Evan Ingram, who is clearly the better tight end. Kyle Rudolph has a 36% targets per route run rate, but he's only running a route on 28% of dropbacks. They're both averaging about 8 receiving expected points per game. So this is a situation where I think, again, the tight end landscape is not that great. And if for some reason Evan Ingram has found his way to your waiver wire, I'd go snatch him up if you're someone who's streaming or needs a bye week fill-in. Excuse me. The other tight end that I'm going to talk about is Tyler Higbee, who might even more so be finding his way to waiver wires soon, because he just hasn't had the spike that I think a lot of people would have expected, given how how good this offense is and how much the Rams are passing the ball. Now, obviously, Cooper Kupp has taken a lot of those opportunities, but the thing that's confusing is that Tyler Higbee actually has some solid peripheral metrics. He only has 1 game over the last 5 weeks with double-digit PPR points, and that was actually this past week. But in his last 5 games, he's averaging over 5.5 targets per game for a 15% target share. He is averaging about 34 receiving yards, has a 1.19 racer, which is really good for a tight end, and is running around on 86% of dropback. So he's on the field, he's getting work, he's getting targeted. He just does not seem to be doing anything. His average depth of target is 5.2 yards, but again, he's only averaging 6.6 receiving expected points per game. So I don't think I would personally send him to my waiver wire, but I wouldn't fault you if you did. I was talking with another buddy this weekend who traded, I forget, it was someone, and it was Michael Pittman and Tyler Higbee for Noah Fant. Now this was several weeks ago, before Michael Pittman started to have a great stretch, and at the time I didn't think, that Fant was that big of an upgrade over Higbee, and obviously Fant was out this past week, so we couldn't use him then. But I think, again, that's a situation where maybe he is, because Higbee has just not been performing from a fantasy perspective whatsoever. So as I wrap up the show, get into the team by team situations, had a question from Josh McAtee on how the passing game changed with Kittle in the mix. And the 49ers did have their highest passing rate over expectation of the season. That's likely due to them being down double digits early on. But the only thing that you really need to know about Jimmy Garoppolo, and I did see that Jimmy G is the highest scoring fantasy quarterback over the last 2 weeks, which is, I think, just noise to me. But Ian Hartitz of PFF pointed out that the worst quarterback in PFF's big time throw rate metric is Jimmy Garoppolo at 1.9%. And the worst quarterback this season in PFF's turnover worthy play rate metric is Jimmy Garoppolo at 5.2%. So I don't know. I don't know if or when we'll see Trey Lance as the starter, unless the 49ers get out of playoff contention or Jimmy Garoppolo gets hurt. So hopefully one of those two. Not that I'm wishing Garoppolo gets hurt, but anyway, I'm going to talk about the running backs here. Elijah Mitchell is about as close to a bell cow as we've seen from the 49ers. At this point, Trey Sermon is a nothing. He's been healthy, scratched. He hasn't played any snaps. I don't even think he's worth really holding onto at this point as a backup for the 49ers. But Mitchell, over the last 4 games, has a 79% share of the running back touches and an 87% rush share for the running backs. And Mitchell actually had what was surprisingly a season high 61% routes run rate on the week. So I don't really know why that was the case, because JaMycal Hasty had seemed like the primary pass catching back. He had played on 34% of snaps and has a 42% routes run rate over his last 3 games. So I think that passing game usage for Mitchell might be a little bit of noise right now. We'll see how that holds up going forward. But I think the one concern, again, for Mitchell, outside of not getting many targets, is he only has 2 green zone touches in his last 4 games. And that's, again, really what produces those spike weeks for running backs. But again, I'm not that concerned. I think Mitchell's a solid running back 2 for fantasy right now. As far as the pass catchers, I covered the 49ers wide receivers last week, so I'm not going to go too in depth on trends over the last several games. But so I'm going to primarily just talk about what happened in week 9. And week 9 is sort of what I talked about with Deebo Samuel and why I was a little bit concerned about him, with Kittle coming back, with Ayuk starting to, I guess, sort of break out, and I guess not break out, but at least get out of the doghouse. But because over the last 2 weeks, Brandon Ayuk now leads the 49ers in routes run. He has 15 targets over the last 2 games. So he's had a nice stretch. Deebo Samuel also still had 9 targets, which led the team, had a 23% target share, but that 23% was his season low for a game, still ran around on 91% of dropbacks. But in any case, George Kittle and Ayuk both had 8 targets. Both of them had 6 receptions and each found the end zone. Kittle and Ayuk both had over 100 air yards as well. So again, Kittle, this is the Kittle we wanted all season, and we're hoping we would get right out of the gate, but unfortunately didn't happen. Now, both Kittle and Ayuk had over 5 fantasy points over expectation, so I don't expect that level of fantasy production to continue for both of them, but it's a scenario where with all of the weapons in this offense healthy, with the fact that the 49ers want to run the ball more than most teams, there is some concern around Deebo Samuel and him being able to sustain the production that he's had this season. So I don't think there's anything you can do with him right now. I wouldn't buy low on him by any means, and you're not going to get as much as you would want from him given his historical performance this season. But it's a tricky situation, and I think something to monitor going forward. The last team that I'm going to talk through is the Las Vegas Raiders. Have obviously gone through just a mess this season between Gruden and the Henry Ruggs situation, but going to talk fantasy here, and wrap up the show. Derek Carr, unfortunately, from a fantasy perspective, hasn't been that great. He's quarterback 17 on the season. He doesn't have a game above 25 fantasy points, but that could change this week against the Chiefs. Over his last 5 games, he has 272 passing yards per game, a 4% touchdown rate, a 7.3 adjusted yards per attempt, a 0.98 pacer, and a 2.2% CPOE. So from a sort of real football perspective, he's been playing well and has kept the Raiders in playoff contention with, I think everyone in the AFC West has exactly 5 wins right now. So if you're looking for, I forget which teams are on bye this week, but if you're looking for a spot start from Derek Carr, he could be a solid option this week. As far as the running backs go, Josh Jacobs, his snap share went back up to 49% after it was down at 36% in week 7. He left the game in week 7 due to that injury and then had to bye in week 8. So it looks like they're sort of slowly ramping him back up because it had been at 60% or above in the 3 weeks before that. But from an opportunity standpoint, over the last 5 games, Jacobs has a 62% running back touch share, which is pretty solid. But Kenyon Drake is at 28% himself and only is averaging 3 fewer PPR points per game. Looks like Jacobs still, again, I've talked about green zone touches so much this episode, but they are such a big point of emphasis for me. But Jacobs has about 2 green zone touches per game in his last 5. No other, Raiders running back has more than 1 total in the last 5 games. So that's certainly encouraging that he's locked down that. And Jacobs is averaging a solid 5 high value touches per game. He's got 3.4 receptions per game over his last 5 games. So that's just really solid and not really something I would have expected from Josh Jacobs. The other thing is that his receiving expected points is at 5.7 per game over his last 5, which is, again, higher than Jonathan Taylor. He is at about even from a fantasy points over expectation standpoint. So Josh Jacobs, as much sort of crap that he got this offseason for being a terrible draft pick, is a solid player right now. Probably see him in a similar vein to Elijah Mitchell from a fantasy perspective. But I think what a lot of people want to hear about is Darren Waller, and fret no more, because Darren Waller had his best game of the season, not his best game of the season, best game since week 2. He had 11 targets, which was his most since week 2. He had the most air yards with 99, most expected fantasy points with 20.7, and his highest whopper at 0.6. And in this game, obviously the first, without Henry Ruggs, Waller ran a route on 85% of dropbacks, which is about in line with his season-long rate, had a 37% air yard share and 24% target share. But not far behind him was Hunter Renfrow, who had 9 targets, 7 receptions of his own. That was a 20% target rate. His routes per dropback was at 71%, and he was actually 4th on the team in that, behind both Zay Jones and Bryan Edwards. So I don't really know what caused that, because I don't believe he got hurt, and the game was competitive throughout. But Hunter Renfrow, again, JJ Zachariason with this one, has caught fewer than 5 receptions in just one game this season. So he is having just a really strong year so far. Just a PPR monster, sort of. I think has eclipsed at this point Jarvis Landry as a better PPR receiver, at least in my mind. In this game, I'm looking here, Hunter Renfrow had a 2.7 average depth of target from Derek Carr there. Both Zay Jones and Bryan Edwards had nearly identical stat lines. Both had 4 targets for 73 air yards. They're adding Deshaun Jackson. So I know, late last week when all the OBJ news was coming out that the Raiders were a potential hot team for to add Odell Beckham, but I don't think that they would, especially since he cleared waivers, given that they're again adding Deshaun Jackson and knew that Odell Beckham was going to potentially be available to them. Now, that doesn't totally eliminate them, but in any case, Bryan Edwards, I think, has the best chance to step into Ruggs' role. He had about 11 receiving expected points. He didn't catch a ball, so he had negative 11 fantasy points over expectation. But yeah, we'll see. I think that all of these Raiders players are in a chance to have great games against the Chiefs this upcoming week. Okay, got through the show. Again, another week. Got halfway through the season. We're at week 8 already. Week 8. We're at week 10. Week 10 is coming up. Couple final reminders. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Only $5 per month. Get access to this show live. Be able to chat with me and some others. Make sure to tune into the show tomorrow at 9:15 p.m. Eastern time to figure out how much we're all bidding on Eno Benjamin, and hope that you all have a great week 10. We'll see you next week.